I'm Dr. Joe Sprinkle, and this video will be a short lecture on Psalm 121, a psalm that begins with, "I lift up my eyes to the hills," and which is also in a collection of songs, psalms known as the Songs of Ascent. Let's read the psalm in English Standard Version. "I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is a shade on your right hand. The sun will not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep you from keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore." Begin with some introductory matters. First of all, what kind of genre is Psalm 121? Well, as we said, it is in the collection known as the Songs of Ascent, and that all the Psalms from Psalm 120 through Psalm 134 have that label in their superscript. And we argued in a previous video that this refers to Psalms that were sung especially when people made pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the festivals like the Feast of Passover and the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. But that doesn't really tell you the genre other than it was sung on those occasions, if that's the right interpretation. As far as a genre goes, this particular psalm seems to be a psalm of protection or confidence expressed as a priestly blessing. More specifically, it looks like the worshiper is asking a question in dialogue with a priest, and the priest then answers the question by giving a blessing on the worshiper. So you can see the structure here. You have the pilgrim's question, verses 1 and 2, excuse me, which is in first person narration, talking about I and me and that kind of thing. But then in verses 3 through 8, it goes to second person narration, which is probably the priest answering him. And so there are two voices here represented in the psalm, the pilgrim's voice and the priest's voice. So let's get into it. Well, before I get into it, I should make a very quick text critical note. Some scholars would like to amend the text when he makes that answer in verse 2, "My help comes from the Lord." If you changed one letter, basically deleted one letter, that would change it from "my help" to "help." You can see the Hebrew here, and at least in the consonantal text, "my help" is one little letter, the smallest of the Hebrew letters, the yod, at the end of the word. If you deleted that, then it would say, "Help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth," and that could be a part of the priestly answer rather than a tentative statement by the pilgrim. And so it would make the psalm smoother, actually, though the change is speculative and conjectural since no manuscript or version supports it. The Masoretic text as it stands, so the Hebrew text as it stands, the pilgrim gives a preliminary answer before the priest makes his response, and that makes good enough sense. But I just mentioned in passing that it is possible that maybe there's one extra letter here that would change the structure of it and make verse 2 a part of the priestly answer, "Help comes from the Lord." But nonetheless, I'll assume that the Masoretic text is correct in my analysis that follows. So let's start with the question. which is a movement away from false hopes to the true hope in God. I lift up my eyes to the hills, it says in verse 1. And the question here, is this a positive statement or is this a negative statement? Is it a source of danger or is it a source of hope? It might be a source of danger. I lift up my eyes to the hills on my way in pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and the hills might contain bandits, robbers lying in wait, hiding behind the rocks in the hill, ready to come out and prey on the hapless pilgrim as he is making his way to Jerusalem. So it could be a source of danger, or it could be a source of refuge. Hills could be a place where a pilgrim could flee, could find a hiding place if he needed to. Though if that's the idea, that's not the place for true refuge. True refuge is to be found not behind the rocks on a hill, but rather in God. Yet another view is a false hope of pagan gods. On top of the hills, certain times of ancient Israel, they built shrines called high places, and that could represent the false hope of the pagan gods that were often worshipped at these high places. In which case, I lift up my eyes to hills. Is that where my help comes from? No, 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 no. My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. And so that could be a false hope the hills could represent. Or it could represent the true hope. As I look at the hills and the spiny mountainous terrain that leads through the heart of the country to Jerusalem, as I look to where those hills lead to, it leads to Mount Zion in Jerusalem, the place of God's abode, the temple. And that is the place from which true help arises. So it may be in anticipation of the hills surrounding Jerusalem and the Temple Mount itself, which is a true source of hope and refuge. Well, whatever we make of verse 1, where shall my help come? That, by the way, should be read as a question. The King James Bible made it a statement. I lift up my eyes to the hills from where my help comes. But almost all interpreters today understand that second part as a question, and that makes the most sense of the passage in context, it seems to me. And the answer that he gives, my help comes from the Lord, again, assuming that that word my, that one little Hebrew letter, yod, is retained, the pilgrim is drawing the tentative conclusion that the source of his help is God, the power that made the mountains. In verses 3 through 8, then, the priest will come in and he will give his response and a blessing on the pilgrim. And the priest, and as I imagine it, says this: he will not let your foot be moved. To be moved, or it could be translated to slip, is an example of metonymy for misfortune in an accident. So you're climbing on the rocky areas. If your foot is moved, if it slips, you'll fall or hurt yourself. But God is going to protect you. He will not let your foot be moved. Neither does he slumber or sleep, it says. Now, this is in contrast with pagan gods. Pagan gods like Baal and Tammuz were gods that slept. Indeed, Tammuz was said to have died during the winter, only to rise again in the spring. But not so the Lord. He doesn't slumber. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't go away. He's always there to provide his promised protection. So God will not let your foot be moved. He will neither slumber nor sleep. Then he makes a statement, the Lord is your keeper in verse 5. Keeper is a protector, like a herdsman who keeps and watches and protects his animals. So the Lord is the keeper of his people who watches over and keeps and protects us. And it says that the Lord is your shade on your right hand. The Lord will protect you from that hot Palestinian sun. Again, the pilgrims passing through, if they don't have the proper gear, don't have hats on, they might be susceptible to sunstroke. And so the fact that the Lord is your shade to protect you from such dangers is an important promise here that would relate to their experience as they traveled. It goes on to say that the sun will not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. Now, we've already talked about the sun striking, but what about the moon? That seems a little bit odd. The new moon will not strike you by night. And this at least reflects some sort of fear of the moon. It was traditionally thought that the moon could cause certain illnesses. You have that in English words like lunacy, which is later related to lunar, has to do with the moon, or when people get moonstruck, that somehow the moon can strike us. Those are reflections of the belief that something can happen from especially the full moon. And lunacy is related to the notion that madness fluctuated with the phases of the moon. And I don't know whether there's any truth to this, but a nurse once told me that the emergency room seemed to be busier during a full moon for whatever reason. But whether or not the moon has any power, there's no need to be afraid of it, because God is with us. The sun will not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. Goes on to say, verse 7 and 8, the Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. Now that going out and coming in, again, in the context of a Song of Ascent, which we take to be a pilgrim psalm, probably means something like when you leave to go home and when you come back for the next pilgrim feast, that God will continue to watch over you in all that time in between your being here and your coming back again. So what are we to make of Psalm 121? And how can an Israelite pilgrim psalm be used by Christians? Well, I think in principle, it tells us we can generally look to God as our help and protector. Now, at issue here is, are these promises really that true? I mean, do Christians never suffer accidents? Do believers never suffer accidents? And if believers do suffer accidents, what good are these promises? That's a little bit of a problem of both exegesis and application. And so there are different ways that we can try to explain that. One way to look at this would be to say that all these phrases in the psalm are really only prayers. So all the verbs in that case should be translated, may the Lord do these things. Not that he will not allow your foot to slip, but may he not allow your foot to slip. And grammatically, this is just possible, though it does seem to be negated by the affirmative statement, the Lord is your keeper, and the Lord is your shade in verse 5. That doesn't seem to be quite as easily manipulated. But the other verbs that are in the imperfect could be translated as wish. There's no grammatical difference between a future, though this is what will happen, and a wish may such and such happen. Both of them are the same form in Hebrew. And so if you take it as a wish, well, that's a pious wish by the priest. May the Lord um, keep your foot from slipping, and so on and so on and so forth. Though I think that's not the most likely interpretation. It's at least a possible way of explaining the discrepancy between reality, where sometimes believers do suffer accidents, and the statements in this psalm. Another way of looking at it, though, is to say that it's a general promise, and this is my preferred way of looking at it. This psalm encourages us to trust in God for protection, and so we should. Yet the truth is, this is a general truth, like the truths in Proverbs. In Proverbs, you have statements like, the hand of the diligent makes it rich. Well, that's usually the case. That's typically the case. Work hard, you'll do well. But there are exceptions to the rule. And so it is here. This is what is usually the case, what is ordinarily the case, but it's not necessarily a truth without exception. Taken in the light of biblical teaching as a whole, the psalm and the scriptures do not mean that we will never suffer, but only that no suffering can befall us unless God so wills and allows it. And thus, an occasional instance of suffering is not inconsistent with the idea of God's general protection of believers. Yes, God as a rule protects us from harm, but when he does not, there's good reason why he does not. And if we believe this is so, it changes our whole perspective on suffering. And it also gives us courage to face each day and its perils, trusting in God's protection. That's my analysis of Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills. It's one of the Songs of Ascent. And I am Dr. Joe Sprinkle.